Thank you so much, Marcus, and thank you quite generally to everyone for having me here. It's been a hell of a lot of fun to talk to people over the past few days and see a new place and put faces to names that I've only ever seen in print. So it's been great to talk to you all. First question, I guess, is everyone sufficiently caffeinated for a talk? Yes? Good. Okay. Second question is, if I came along and I told you that a theorem of pure mathematics completely refutes one of the dominant views in philosophy of mind, what kind of reaction would you have? Some sort of quizzical expressions. People are looking a little bit puzzled. I like Professor Lycan's expression there. Good, this is great, because that's exactly how I felt when I came across this for the first time, especially because it was presented in such a way that it was supposed to be the most obvious thing in the world to me. So what I'm going to do today is look at this argument in a little bit of detail. And firstly, the way we're going to go about doing that is, well, there's the abstract. You've all seen the abstract. Bealer kind of kicked these discussions off in the 70s. Some people like Jeffrey Hellman, Ned Block, and Neil over at OSU have talked about this. But it's come to the fore again with Hans Halvorson's recent book on logic and philosophy of science. And so that's the kind of presentation I'm going to be focusing on today. The way I'm going to go about doing that is I'm going to start with a little bit of ground clearing work, as it says up here. I want to try and get on the table some of the relevant things that are being taken for granted in the presentation of the argument. So a kind of rough and ready characterization of functionalism, as well as talking a little bit about Ramsey sentences because they play a prominent role. Then I'm going to look at the argument itself. I'm going to present it initially more or less verbatim, as Halvorson does. And when I say it's concise, I really mean it's concise. It's around about half a page, almost entirely formal, and ends with quite an extravagant conclusion. So if you're anything like me, that presentation leaves you wondering, how does this actually work? So I'm going to start filling in some of the details, trying to explain how the steps are supposed to establish this groundbreaking conclusion. And then I'm going to respond in a couple of ways. The first is to evaluate and assess the appeal that's made to Beth's theorem by the argument. It seems like that theorem is doing a lot of work in order to derive this conclusion. So I'm going to take a little look at that and say, well, how exactly is this working in the context of what looks like a higher order logic? And the second thing that I'm going to do is try and be a good analytic philosophy student and say, wait a minute, what do we mean by that? Right? Everyone in this debate is talking about definability. They're talking about implicit definability, explicit definability. And so it's worth pausing and saying, does everyone involved in this discussion have the same thing in mind when they're talking about this? And also, as will become clear, I haven't added here, is everyone equally problematized by this? Right? So that's how we're going to go about it to get my conclusion at the end, which I won't state just now. I want people to stay until the end of the talk. If I just say yes or no, everyone's going to get up and leave. So, put loosely, functionalism is an incredibly dominant view in the end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century. We put it very loosely. We can say that the functionalist wants us to understand mental states in terms of the role that they play within a larger causal network, right? So we should focus on what they do rather than what they're made up of. And this is about as much as functionalists seem to agree on. After you get to past that point, the view just quickly fragments into a whole lot of varieties. And so, as we'll see later on, it's really important to be careful when talking about functionalism simpliciter as this kind of monolithic homogeneous entity. But for now, this kind of rough and ready characterization will have to suffice. And when functionalists talk about mental states, they say that mental states are characterized by their role in a network of related states, and these relations are often expressed through the use of Ramsification. So what I have in mind here is David Lewis in 1970 talking about Ramsey sentences. So what is a Ramsey sentence? Well, let's suppose, for the moment that we have a finitely axiomatizable first order theory, let's call it T, and it has a whole bunch of observational vocabulary, that's our O1 to On, and it also has some theoretical vocabulary in there as well, these H1, H2, etc., etc. Right? Given that T is finitely axiomatizable, we can think of the entire theory as just like a single sentence. It's the conjunction of all of the axioms, right? It's this conjunction of all the axioms. And what we can then do is we can utilize second order existential generalization to transform that single sentence of our theory into what we have here that says, rather than say specifically, I've got these named properties, these named entities, H1, H2, etc., there is some property or other. There exists a property x1 up to xn that play the requisite kind of role. So this sentence is called the Ramsey sentence of the theory. And a lot of people have pointed out, people like Hinteker have pointed out that the logical consequences that are involving the observational terms in the original sentence are also logical consequences of the second Ramsified sentence. So if you're someone that doesn't like theoretical entities, doesn't want to commit to certain properties, thinks that metaphysics is kind of spooky, I know there's a lot of people here that feel that way, there might be a sort of inclination towards Ramsifying, right? So while the original sentence says that there's some specific property H, the Ramsey sentence tells us that there's some property or other that does the requisite job, okay? So that's the ground clearing. We're in a position now to talk about the actual argument that Halvorson gives. And the first kind of move that he makes is to try and characterize functionalism. And according to Halvorson, functionalism consists of two theses. The positive thesis that says that mental properties are defined by the role that they play with regard to each other and whatever physical properties might be in the system. And the negative thesis that these mental properties can't be explicitly defined in terms of the physical properties. From here, he decides to define a theory, again, I'm going to call it T, where it's just the union of this physical vocabulary, which he calls sigma, together with the mental vocabulary, each term of which he calls R1 up to Rn, right? So we have this theory that collects together both the mental and the physical vocabulary. And he offers this proposal that our theory T provides functional definitions of R1 to Rn, these mental terms, in terms of sigma, the physical stuff, just in case in each model M of the Ramsey sentence of the theory, that's T to the R, there are unique realizing properties. So M of R1 to M of Rn, right? He then proceeds to claim that, well, T provides a functional definition of these mental terms only if T manages to implicitly define those mental terms in terms of the physical stuff, the sigma. So T provides functional definitions of the mental in terms of the physical only if it implicitly defines them that way. Right? So what do? We take two models of our theory. Let's just call them M and N. And he proposes we need to look at their sigma redux, right? We take M and N, we look at the restriction of the models to just this vocabulary sigma, that physical stuff, and we say, well, these are models of the Ramsey sentence, right? Given the clause, given this kind of uniqueness clause in his proposal, we'll also get that the unique realizing properties are the same across the models, exactly as he wants them to be. And then he starts really going to work. He says, well, I've managed to get so far that we have an implicit definition. Whenever I have a functional theory or a functional definition, I have an implicit definition. I know, I've done a model theory course. Beth's definability theorem tells me that whenever I've got an implicit definition, well, then I have to have an explicit definition of exactly the same thing, right? But remember that this is exactly what the negative thesis of functionalism says simply cannot be done. Right? And so this is kind of more or less verbatim. I told you, it's a very short argument. And he makes this conclusion that I'll quote now, that this argument, if successful, shows that functionalism is inconsistent. The positive thesis of functionalism entails the negation of the negative thesis. Surprisingly, however, functionalism lives on, apparently oblivious to this little problem of inconsistency. Something about the principle of charity comes to mind immediately, that maybe not the most deferential way of putting the point, but he seems pretty convinced of his conclusion. So
That's a quote.
That's a quote. Yeah, that is a verbatim quote from page 250 of Logic and Philosophy of Science. It seems to be implying that people that still want to talk about functionalism are not as well brushed up on their logic as they should be, I guess, to put it mildly. So there's a couple of observations I want to make. Firstly, that he's not arguing that functionalism is an unsatisfactory account of mind. He's arguing something much stronger, that it's just simply logically inconsistent. And second, I really want to emphasize this and get you guys to notice that nothing that I've said so far in the argument turns on anything in particular about philosophy of mind, right? So if his argument is correct, then it's actually even more general and the conclusion is even stronger than he realizes. It will mean that all functionalist accounts are inconsistent. So that means the people in philosophy of biology that are interested in species, scientific explanation, people working in philosophy of gender who propose functionalist accounts, all of these will be completely inconsistent for the same reason. So it really is a pretty sort of remarkable conclusion, which I think deserves to be carefully scrutinized, right? If you're going to make something that bold, we need to slow down a minute and think about it. So, adding a few details, what I want to do is start by highlighting some of the moves that are made in this argument and how it is that this is supposed to establish an inconsistency in functionalism, and see what's kind of being taken for granted in the argument. So he starts by construing the language in which we're having these discussions kind of model theoretically. So we've got a set of symbols, constants, predicates, functions, etc., with associated arities. And in the case of functionalist discussions, there seems to be a broad divide where we can say we have a vocabulary of physical terms and a vocabulary of mental terms, right? We've got these two types. If we join these together, then we can get a theory that has the content of both the mental stuff and the physical stuff, and we can start exploring the relationship between these two vocabularies, between the types of language that's being used in both of these cases. So the functionalist wants to claim that the mental states should be understood in terms of the role that they play as a part of the larger cognitive system. And so in order to capture this, what Halvorson proposes is that the theory T functionally defines the mental vocabulary in terms of the physical vocabulary, just in case every model of the ramified theory recognizes a property expressed by each of the terms where R1 to Rn is the mental terminology again. So we have that our model of the ramified theory recognizes these terms. And he says, well, I'm gonna make an even stronger claim that if our theory T provides functional definitions of this mental vocabulary that we've been discussing in terms of the physical vocabulary, well then what it's actually doing is providing an implicit definition, right? It's implicitly defining the former in terms of the latter. And this is where he really starts to get the model theoretic apparatus to kick in. So again, we look at our two models of the theory T, I'm just going to call them M and N, and we examine their sigma redux. All this means is that we're looking at what the models M and N say when they forget all of the mental vocabulary of the theory. They forget about the R1 to Rn, which is essentially kind of the same thing as just restricting them to this physical vocabulary sigma, right? And when we make this kind of restriction, if these models are models of our theory T, well then kind of trivially, their sigma redux are going to be models of the Ramsey sentence, right? Because the Ramsey sentence makes all of these hypothetical or theoretical terms disappear as if by magic. And so when we're just ignoring all of them anyway, we're going to get a model of the Ramsey sentence kind of easily. And given that he has this clause stating that each model has to satisfy a unique realizing property corresponding to each of these terms in the vocabulary, then we're going to get that it actually is the same across the various models. Right? We're going to get that M as recognized, the property corresponding to the mental term recognized in one model is exactly the same as the property that's recognized by the other model. Right? The models are just going to agree as far as this mental stuff goes. They're not going to start disagreeing with each other. And it seems like the reason he's bringing in this talk of unique realizing properties is to try and build a bridge between the mathematical apparatus that he wants to wheel in and the property talk that functionalists are often engaged in. So that's how I see the role that this is playing. And then he introduces his coup de grace, right? He says that, well, if T implicitly defines the mental in terms of the physical, well, then by Beth's theorem, it has to explicitly define the mental in terms of the physical as well. But remember, this is exactly what the negative thesis of functionalism said cannot be done, right? So it seems that if this argument is sound, if he's right, well, then there's a lingering contradiction in functionalism. Mental states both can and can't be explicitly defined in terms of physical states. So that's the kind of fleshed out version of the argument for this contradiction. And so the suggestion is that a wide and disparate array of different views in philosophy of mind, and as we've seen more generally outside of philosophy of mind, are all going to be inconsistent. It's worth pausing to just think for a second about how many views go under the word functionalism, right? There's an awful lot of them. Shoemaker did this big survey. There's just pages and pages of different people calling themselves functionalists. So there's an immediate question of, are all of these views equally problematized by this argument? And that's something that I'm going to return to in detail. And it's also assuming that the use of things like Beth's definability theorem are completely unproblematic in these kinds of discussions and debates. But nevertheless, despite these things, he's concluding that functionalism, just as a whole, regardless of subject matter, needs to be rejected on the grounds of inconsistency. So now that we've kind of fleshed out this argument and we can see how the conclusion is supposed to be arrived at, we can start trying to respond and thinking about some of these moving parts of the argument. So in particular, I'm going to start, this is a logic group talk after all, I'm going to start by talking about Beth's theorem, right? And in particular, what I want to argue is that either the result is inapplicable for reasons that we'll get into, or it's kind of trivial. And you might think that undermining the use of Beth's theorem is enough to get people off the hook and defuse the argument. But what I think is really interesting is that it turns out, actually, that's not enough. So just undermining the appeal to Beth's theorem in this context is not enough to save functionalism from the supposed peril of this argument. I'm still going to do it because it's interesting, but it's not as easy as I'm going to just take out this one step and then boom, everything's back to normal, right? So I've said this a bunch of times: Beth theorem, Beth definability. What is this? So it's a deep and interesting result in first-order model theory, and it tells us that the model theoretic notions of implicit and explicit definability line up exactly, right? I'm going to try and keep the discussion relatively informal. If you want, you can read your Chang and Keisler or your Wilfred Hodges. There's lots of different ways of proving the theorem. I'm not going to prove it. I'm going to use my favorite proof technique, which I've stolen from Stu Shapiro, which is proof by just trust me. But you can use Craig's interpolation theorem to get there. You can define a topology on a space of types to get there. I also spoke to Gabe Conant recently, who said, I've just decided to come up with an interesting topological proof that's equivalent to Beth's theorem. The image of every open set under a certain surjection is itself open, because some people can apparently just do that in an afternoon, which I'm slightly envious of. But so to try and explain what's going on here, let's say that we've got two languages. We've got an original language, L. We extend it to a new language, call it L prime. Maybe we add a new predicate or something. And we ask ourselves, when is a formula of this expanded language equivalent to something that I already had in the original language, right? This is exactly what Beth's theorem tells us. If we take any two models, just call them A and B, of this expanded language theory, if we restrict A to the language of L and we restrict B to the language of L, and those end up being the same thing, well, then the set defined by the formula phi on A is going to be the same as the set defined by the formula phi on B. The L prime structures can be explicitly defined in terms of the formula phi, right? Whenever we're in this situation, whenever this situation obtains, we know that the formula phi is going to be given by a formula in the original language. The set that we define, you know, the little a's inside the domain of the model, such that the model thinks that the formula phi holds of those objects, that's going to be definable in the original language. So that's a kind of neat property, just purely formally. And if the L reducts of A and B are identical, we're going to have that there's an L formula, which I'm just calling psi because I'm not very imaginative, which according to our theory, T is coextensive with that formula phi, right? So T satisfies this universally quantified expression. And so because T satisfies that universally quantified expression, any model of T is going to satisfy this condition, right? So the key point is that Beth's theorem tells us when something in a richer, expanded language was already definable in the original, slightly more impoverished language. And so it links together these two notions of explicit and implicit definability. It's a kind of neat result, sort of not unlike the completeness theorem in that it's telling us when certain properties line up between semantics and syntax. So we've got this, this nice kind of feature of the language. But you're probably wondering, like, what the hell has this got to do with philosophy of mind, right? It's the fact that this is being appealed to in a discussion about functionalism should raise some red flags. So there's probably mathematicians in the room that are saying, wait a minute, you need to tell me about the signature, the domain, and all these other relevant mathematical features before I can start talking about Beth's theorem. And these are legitimate questions that should engender some caution in us philosophers, because, you know, we're all too familiar with these kind of grandiose claims that this theorem simply refutes or undermines or proves some philosophical position. And what's more, as I've kind of stressed all the way through, Beth's theorem is a result of first-order model theory, right? It's a deep, interesting result of first-order model theory. It's not entirely obvious that this is happening in a first-order setting, right? The fact that we've invoked Ramsey sentences to existentially generalize over predicate positions seems to make it look at least a little bit like we're not using pure first-order logic, right? So we need to ask ourselves, what is going on with the use of Beth's theorem in a higher order language? And luckily, my supervisor wrote the Bible on second order logic, so I've been able to bug him about it for a while.
I remember it.
Assuming you remember it. You at least remembered it when we talked about it, so don't worry. The first thing to note is that if we're using full-blown second order logic, we can't get the standard proofs of Beth's definability theorem to go through. The consequence relation isn't compact. And to preempt a question of Reed that I didn't have an answer to yesterday, but I do today, there are actually counterexamples to Beth's definability theorem in full second order logic. Maybe we can talk about that later. But so if we're using this kind of full-blown second order logic, it doesn't enjoy the Beth definability property. What's more, if we're only using a finite fragment of second order logic, we get a weak Beth-style result, but it's not really cool and interesting like it is in first order model theory. It's just a kind of fairly trivial consequence of the use of a more expressive language, right? But what I want to point out is that if we are in this case where it's trivial, that might actually make the problem worse for the functionalist, right? Because rather than appealing to this kind of high-powered technical apparatus from model theory in order to derive a contradiction, if the key working part is actually a trivial consequence of the semantics you're using, well, then the contradiction is just happening in theory, right? So simply undermining the use of Beth's theorem in this context doesn't seem like it's enough to really get the functionalist off the hook. If Beth's theorem is redundant, then the contradiction is actually just lingering in functionalism. The other thing that I should add is that what I've said so far assumes that we're using full or so-called standard second order logic. That might not necessarily be the case. Maybe Halvorson wants to appeal to Beth's theorem because he's got in mind something in between a first and second order logic, maybe something like Henkin semantics. Here, the Beth-style result is not trivial, but it's also not completely obvious that the analog of it holds for Henkin models, right? So there's still some mathematical work to be done to show that the theorem is applicable if he's in this kind of setting. I don't think there's any in-principle barrier to doing this. I think the most straightforward way would be to try and prove Beth's theorem in a many-sorted first-order logic, and then appeal to Stu's equivalence proof that many-sorted first-order logic is equivalent to Henkin semantics. So I don't think there's an in-principle barrier to doing it, but the point is it still needs to be done. I've not done it, probably not going to do it, but if that floats your boat, go for it. Tell me how it works. It sounds like it would be interesting. So the key point of this section is that it seems like, at the very least, more work needs to be done in order to legitimately appeal to Beth's theorem, right? So either the result is inapplicable in full second order logic, or bad case, it's trivial because we're using a finite fragment of said logic, or we need to prove the result for ourselves to say I am actually allowed to wheel in this tool to get my conclusion. But these kind of logico-mathematical concerns by themselves aren't enough to save functionalism, right? They don't get functionalism off the hook. So for that reason, I'm going to try and turn to some more sort of purely philosophical considerations of who exactly is the argument targeting? Is it targeting them accurately? And even if it is targeting people accurately, is everyone involved understanding things the same way? I think the answer to most of those questions is just no, but I'll give you reasons. I promise I will give reasons. So recall that the way that Halvorson gets this thing going is he says, functionalism is just the conjunction of these two claims, the positive thesis and the negative thesis. The Beth-style argument shows that the first of these entails the falsity of the second, and so it's contradictory. One thing I want to point out to start with, though, is that when we're having these discussions of Ramsey sentences, is everyone understanding the relevant concepts in the same way? There's at least two different things that functionalists might be doing when they're invoking Ramsey sentences in their discussions, right? So the first is using them to describe a role property. Second is specifying the conditions that a property has to satisfy in order to count as the denotation of predicate. And this is something that the argument that is given just completely glosses over. But depending on how you're construing things, whether it's in case one or case two, that's going to really affect the kind of functionalism that you get as a result, right? So it's going to really affect the applicability of this argument. I think that the most charitable way to understand this argument against functionalism is to take it in this first sense and say it's only targeted towards people like Bloch and Fodor, but we'll go through why I think that now. So if we're in case one, the idea is that we have an identity statement where both the left and right-hand sides of the expression are denoting properties. And this is a fairly natural way to understand different types of functionalist talk, that particularly when people say that a mental property is to be identified with the role property, i.e. the property of fulfilling a certain role within a cognitive system, right? Big problem. A lot of functionalists just say those things don't exist, right? So many prominent functionalists, the ones that come to mind immediately are David Lewis and Jaegwon Kim. They both explicitly deny the existence of these properties, right? So according to these functionalists, mental properties actually can be identified with physical properties. So they don't buy the negative thesis that Halvorson says is constitutive of functionalism. They reject it since mental properties actually are supposed to be identified with physical properties. They also reject the positive thesis because they say that role properties just don't exist. So the possibility of mental properties being defined in terms of those role properties is impossible, right? You can't define something in terms of something that I don't think exists. So the first kind of initial point that I want to really stamp my foot on here is that far from undermining just functionalism simpliciter, all functionalist views are completely inconsistent. It seems like when we consider the functionalism of people like David Lewis and Jaegwon Kim, the argument doesn't even get off the ground, right? And there's a little caveat that Lewis talks about role fillers, but he explicitly denies role properties, right? He's understanding the use of Ramsey sentences as case 2, which we're going to come on to now. So yeah, it's at best, this argument is only going to apply to a specific subset of functionalist views that will endorse something like Halvorson's 2 theses, right? People that don't endorse them simply can't be argued against in this way. Yeah, said that. I got too excited and didn't press the button. So what about case 2? Well, people might be understanding the Ramsey sentence as this sort of second case, that specifying the conditions a property needs to satisfy to be the denotation of a predicate. The problem with that is this means giving up the negative thesis that Halvorson needs for his argument, right? He has the positive and negative. If you're in this second case, well then what people like Lewis and Kim are saying is that actually the way I'm understanding the use of Ramsey sentences is to give me a physical property that fulfills the requisite kind of task, does the job that I'm interested in, right? So if they're explicitly saying that they want a physical property to fill this role, well, then they're just immediately abandoning his negative thesis, right? So I think if the argument is going to affect any variety of functionalism, we should understand the use of Ramsey sentences as case 1, and we should restrict our attention to just the views that endorse something like his 2 theses, right? His positive and negative thesis. So that gives us the so-called psycho-functionalists. We'll restrict our attention accordingly. Now, those of you that are familiar with these views might find this bit slightly more interesting, right? Because it does seem like Ned Block and Jerry Fodor endorse something that look a lot like the positive and negative theses that Halvorson outlines, right? He says that the mental properties are to be identified with role properties, which is the positive thesis, and they also deny that the mental properties can be explicitly defined in terms of just physical properties, which seems pretty much like the negative thesis. So, if everyone is understanding the relevant terms in the same way, it seems like when we've restricted our attention down to just this class of views, it seems like the argument might have found its mark and might be able to establish an inconsistency in this style of functionalism. Right? So already it's backing off that grandiose conclusion. Problem is, I don't think everyone is understanding the terms in the same way. it seems that when psychofunctionalists are interested in talking about implicit definitions, they kind of take themselves to be talking about something like, well, there's some property or other that interacts causally with things like behavior and expressions and other physical or mental states, right? That's the notion of implicit definition that they have in mind. The problem, however, is that that's not exactly what the mathematicians have in mind for this case, right? According to the model theory, what implicit definition means is that we let lambda be a signature extension of chi, we let t be an arbitrary lambda theory, and we'll have phi be a formula in the language of L lambda. Well then, for any models, M and N, if the restriction of those models to just the vocabulary in chi is the same, well then the formula phi is going to give you the same set definable off both of those cases, right? And this is not a particularly technical worry, right? You don't need to be a mathematician to appreciate the point here. It just seems like the two parties in the debate are operating under completely different notions of what it is to implicitly define something, right? This doesn't mean that there's no mathematical analog in the vicinity of what the functionalist is proposing. If we sort of read math books and math papers, we see the use of implicit definition bandied about in a lot of places. I think the most illustrative example is going to be Hilbert's Grundlagen. I apologize to the German speakers when I butcher the pronunciation of words. But, you know, in defining things like points and lines in terms of the theory of real numbers, he gives us an implicit definition of the objects of geometry within this new context, rather than focusing on the intrinsic nature of whatever objects he's concerned with. And this kind of Hilbertian sense of implicit definition seems much closer in spirit to what the functionalist has proposed. Importantly, it's very distinct from the notion that's required for Beth definability, right? So I think that the argument relies on a kind of bait and switch. It starts with the functionalist notion of implicit definition, midway through switches it for this technical notion, and then says, therefore, your theory was inconsistent all along, right? So just as Hilbert can be legitimately taken to have provided an implicit definition for geometric terms without providing an explicit definition via Beth definability, so too I think the functionalist can be taken to have provided an implicit definition of mental states in terms of physical states, right? Just because points, lines, and planes can be replaced by tables, chairs, and beer mugs doesn't mean that we can say Beth's theorem means that we can define them in those terms, right? We have to explicitly define them that way. That would seem like a really weird thing for me to come up here and say. So just because the functionalist is engaging with some notion of implicit definition doesn't mean that it's the notion, the technical one that's required for Beth definability. So let's take a look at the explicit case. Given what I've said about this kind of equivocation in the implicit case, should be kind of unsurprising that I think a similar thing is happening when we talk about explicit definition. Right? So for the functionalists, when they talk about explicitly defining the mental in terms of the physical, they have in mind something like a rejection of the type-type identity thesis. These old 1970s claims that like pain just is C fibers firing. The psychofunctionalists don't want to endorse that kind of reductionism. They think that mental properties should be understood in terms of the role that they're playing within a larger cognitive system and not just reduced to the physical properties of that system. So that's the kind of understanding that the functionalist has. For the model theorist, it's the notion of explicit definability is there a formula that I can write down in my formal language, right? So using the setup from before, we say that phi is explicitly definable if there's an L chi formula psi such that our theory says there's a provable equivalence between the two formulae, right? Again, technical notion. It seems like what the functionalist has in mind is not a provable equivalence between two formulae of a formal language, right? To use an old example from Quine, if we suppose that all mammals that have a heart also have kidneys, well then the predicate that picks out having a heart will be coextensive with the predicate of having kidneys. Doesn't seem like those are doesn't seem reasonable to suggest that they're pointing to the same property, right? This provable equivalence or indeed coextension isn't enough for the kinds of purpose that the functionalist has in mind. So simply because a predicate of the formal language might pick out a collection that's coextensive with mental phenomena doesn't constitute an explicit definition of the mental purely in terms of physical in this kind of functionalist sense, right? So yeah, we've got this, to put this point in its kind of most simple form, there's just two different notions of explicit definability that are being employed throughout the discussion, right? On the one hand, we have a very formal consideration from model theory, and on the other, we have concern with physical reductionism on behalf of the functionalist, right? The functionalist isn't particularly concerned with whether or not there exists a formal symbol in the language. Rather, they care about whether these mental states are fully reducible to physical states. A neat kind of response that someone raised to me that someone might already be thinking of is, okay, well, maybe the functionalist isn't using this notion, but they should be, right? I don't think so. I don't think they should be. Don't worry, there's more than just that one bullet point. I always feel nervous when I have reasons for things I say. I am broadly sort of rational. So when we look at why functionalists are engaged in this kind of definition talk, this definability talk in the first place, it's sort of just, it makes it more obvious why this purely formal notion isn't enough, right? So whatever this type of functioning amounts to within a larger cognitive system, that's what it is to be a certain mental state. It's implicitly defined by the role it plays within this system. It's similar to this example that's given of like a carburetor or a kidney in the human body. They can be implicitly functionally defined or implicitly defined by the function they perform as part of this larger system, be it mixing fuel and air or filtering the blood, right? And the explicit notion is concerning this identity theory, type identity. This mental state is the same thing as these neurons firing. And it's a kind of physical reductionism that they're not interested in making. So when we understand that these are the considerations that functionalists have in mind when they talk about definability, we realize that things like, is there a formal symbol of my language that can be provably equivalent? That's not going to be enough to do the job for these kinds of philosophical considerations, right? So the key point I'm trying to make here is that it's not just that, well, we can tweak the argument a little bit and say functionalists should be using the model theoretic notion. I think that rather the argument just simply isn't working, right? It's not going to be able to, we can't logic away these philosophical problems. As hopeful as that might, as appealing as that might be, we can't do that, unfortunately. Philosophy is intractable sometimes. So, to close out, I'll say, what are the kind of conclusions that I'm drawing here? Well, the first one is that rather than undermining functionalism just in its entirety, as the argument claims to do, it's actually not even applicable to some of the most prominent functionalists in the literature, right? So even if it works, it doesn't apply to all functionalists, just this restricted class. When we restrict our attention to just the cases where it seems like the argument is applicable, well, it's utilizing a surreptitious equivocation over the relevant notions of definability in order to establish this conclusion and make it seem really kind of potent. So in closing, I return to the original question we started with, is functionalism inconsistent? I want to say no, but I'm a philosopher and I'm scared of counterexamples. So I'll hedge my bets and say, at least if it is, that still remains to be shown. So thank you all so much for having me here. I've really enjoyed this.